There is a version of your growth that the world will never see. Not the result. The result eventually becomes visible. The transformation becomes evident. The capability becomes undeniable. The life that was built becomes the life that is lived and therefore seen by everyone who encounters it. But the building itself, the actual process, the specific, daily, private moments when the choice was made to do the work rather than avoid it, when the alarm went off in the dark and the decision was made before the world was awake, when the difficult chapter was read and the difficult set was completed and the difficult conversation was had with yourself about what needed to change, when the progress was real but invisible, and the motivation was absent, but the work happened anyway. That version of your growth will never be seen by anyone, and that is exactly where all the real growth happens. Not in the visible moments, not in the moments that are witnessed and acknowledged and responded to with recognition. In the private ones, the unwatched ones, the ones that have no audience and no applause and no external confirmation that what you are doing matters, or that you are doing it correctly, or that the result will justify the effort. The moments when nobody is watching. Those moments are the entire story. Everything else is just what those moments eventually produced. And I want to spend this next hour talking about those moments with you, not as inspiration, though perhaps something inspiring will arrive along the way, as an honest examination of what it actually means to build yourself in the private spaces of your life, what it requires from you, what it produces in you, and why the building that happens when nobody is watching is not just as valuable as the building that happens in public. It is more valuable. It is the only kind of building that produces something permanent. Let me start with a question that I want you to sit with for a moment. A question that is simple in its phrasing and genuinely confronting in its implications. What do you do when nobody is watching? Not what you intend to do, not what you would do if someone you respected were observing. What do you actually do in the private hours, in the moments between the visible commitments of your life, in the spaces that have no audience and therefore no performance pressure and therefore no motivation beyond the internal kind? What happens in those spaces? For most people, if they're genuinely honest with themselves, the answer is something they are not entirely proud of. Not because they are bad people, because the private spaces tend to reveal the gap between the person we present to the world and the person we actually are when the presentation is not required, between the habits we perform in public and the habits we default to when nobody is measuring. Most people are more disciplined in front of witnesses than they are alone, more focused when being observed than when they are not, more committed to their stated values in the moments that are visible than in the moments that are not. And this gap, the gap between the public self and the private self, is the most honest measure of where a person actually is in their development. Not their public achievements, not the visible results, the gap. Because the gap reveals whether the development is genuine or performed, whether the growth is real or managed, whether the person being built is the actual version or the presented one. The goal of building yourself while nobody is watching is to close that gap, to become, through deliberate daily private practice, the person who is the same regardless of who is observing, whose discipline does not depend on an audience, whose commitment does not require the structure of accountability, whose work happens not because someone is watching, but because the work is what they do. That person, the person who is the same in private as in public, whose private hours build the same version of themselves as the visible hours, that person is genuinely free in a way that the performance-dependent person is not, because their growth does not require external conditions to be maintained. It happens in any conditions, in the dark, before anyone is awake,
in the spaces between obligations, in the most ordinary and least observed moments of the most ordinary days. That is the person we are building today, starting with this conversation, starting with the decision to take the private hours as seriously as the public ones, starting with the understanding that nobody is watching and that the person who builds themselves in that condition builds something that the watched version never can. Let me talk about what the unwatched moments actually reveal about who you are, and why that revelation, however uncomfortable it initially is the most useful information available to anyone who wants to grow. When you are being observed, when there is a witness to your effort, a person whose perception of you is influenced by what you do in this moment, your behavior is shaped by two forces simultaneously: the internal force of your actual values and commitments, and the external force of how you want to be perceived. And in the observed moments, these two forces are aligned. They both point in the same direction. Both your internal commitment and your desire to be seen as someone with that commitment pull you toward the disciplined behavior. But when the observation is removed, when the external force disappears and only the internal one remains, the behavior reveals what the internal force actually is. Without the amplification of the external force, the internal one is exposed at its actual strength. And for most people, that actual strength is significantly less than the combined strength of internal and external motivation that powered the public behavior. This is not a character flaw, it is a developmental fact. The internal motivation, the genuine, self-generated, audience-independent drive to build and grow, is a muscle. Like any muscle, it is stronger in some people than others. Like any muscle, it is developed through use and atrophied through disuse. And most people living in a culture that provides abundant external motivation through social media and accountability structures and the constant observation of other people have not needed to develop the internal muscle very far. The external scaffolding has been doing much of the work. The private building practice is the development of that muscle, the deliberate, repeated removal of the external scaffolding so that the internal force must do the work alone. And like any muscle training, the development is uncomfortable and initially feels weaker rather than stronger. The first weeks of building without an audience feel like something is missing rather than like something is being built.
But the muscle is building. In the uncomfortable private hours, in the doing without the watching, in the daily practice of honoring the commitment when the only witness is yourself. And eventually, through weeks and months of this practice, the internal motivation reaches a level of development where it does not require the external scaffolding to function, where the discipline is present in the private hours at approximately the same level as in the public ones, where the gap between the observed self and the unobserved self has closed. That is the goal, the muscle of internal motivation developed to the point where the watching is irrelevant, where you would do the same work regardless of whether anyone is aware of it, where the practice is genuinely for the development rather than for the recognition of the development. Build that muscle in the private hours every day. That is the entire practice. Now I want to talk about the specific kinds of building that happen most powerfully in the private spaces, the kinds of development that not only do not require an audience, but that are actually undermined by one. The first is the building of genuine skill. Skill development has a phase that is genuinely not fit for public consumption, the beginner phase, the phase of fundamental incompetence when the gap between where you are and where you want to be is so large and so obvious that every attempt at the skill is an exercise in being visibly bad at something. This phase is unavoidable. You cannot become good at anything without passing through the phase of being bad at it. The only question is whether you pass through it in private or in public, and the choice matters more than most people realize.
The person who attempts skill development publicly, who shares the early attempts, who performs the learning process for an audience, who builds a public identity around the skill before the skill is built, develops a complicated relationship with the beginner phase, because the audience's presence changes the experience of being bad at something. It is no longer just difficult, it is embarrassing. The incompetence is witnessed. The gap between the claimed identity and the actual capability is visible. And this visibility creates a pressure that distorts the learning. The person performing their skill development for an audience begins to optimize for how the learning looks rather than how the learning works. They perform the parts of the process that are most visible and most impressive and underinvest in the parts that are invisible and unglamorous but essential. They move out of the beginner phase aesthetically, presenting as more advanced than they are, while remaining in it functionally. The private skill developer does not have this problem. They can be fully, productively, uncomplicatedly bad at the thing for as long as the thing requires. They can attempt the embarrassing early versions without embarrassment because there is no audience to be embarrassed in front of. They can focus entirely on the learning rather than on the appearance of learning. This freedom, the freedom to be genuinely bad at something in private without the distorting pressure of public observation, accelerates the development significantly, because the learning happens purely, without the performance layer, without the optimization for appearance, just the direct, honest engagement with the work of developing the skill. Build the skill in private. Become genuinely capable before you become publicly identified as capable. Let the competence precede the reputation, rather than the reputation manufacturing the appearance of competence before it exists. The second kind of building that happens most powerfully in private is the building of character. Character is not what you do when people are watching. Character is what you do when they are not. This is not a novel idea. It has been said in various forms by various people across a long stretch of human history. But the reason it keeps being said is that it keeps being true. And the reason it keeps being true is that character is built precisely in the private moments that its definition refers to. The person who is honest because they are honest, not because honesty is observed and rewarded, is honest in the private moments when dishonesty would be invisible and unpenalized. The person who is disciplined because discipline is who they are, not because discipline is being monitored, is disciplined in the private moments when comfort would be indistinguishable from discipline to anyone watching. These private moments are not just revelatory of character, they are formative of it. Every time you choose the honest thing in the moment when the dishonest thing would never be known, you are building the character of an honest person. Every time you do the disciplined thing in the moment when nobody would know if you did not, you are building the character of a disciplined person. Character is not inherited. It is not given at birth or fixed in childhood beyond the possibility of change. It is built through the accumulation of private choices made consistently in a particular direction over a long enough period that the choices become who you are. Every private moment of discipline is a brick. Every private moment of honesty is a brick. Every private moment of choosing growth over comfort, work over avoidance, integrity over convenience, every one of those is a brick in the character being built in the private spaces of your life. And the structure built from those bricks is not fragile. It does not depend on external conditions remaining favorable or on the presence of witnesses to maintain it. It is solid because it was built from the inside, from the private choices that nobody saw but you made anyway. Build your character in private, one unwatched choice at a time. The third kind of building that happens most powerfully in private is the building of self-trust. Self-trust is the confidence that comes from experience, not the confidence that is performed or claimed by other people's belief in you. The lived, evidence-based, behaviorally earned confidence that comes from knowing, from your own direct experience that you follow through on commitments to yourself. Most people have a complicated relationship with self-trust, not because they are unreliable to other people. Most people are remarkably reliable when it comes to commitments they have made publicly, to people they care about, in contexts where the cost of non-compliance is social. But the commitments they make privately, the promises they make to themselves in the quiet moments when they are alone with their aspirations, those tend to have a different track record. And the track record matters because self-trust, like all trust, is built or destroyed through experience. And the consistent pattern of making commitments to yourself and not following through, however understandable each individual non-compliance, however justified each individual exception, accumulates into an internal knowledge that your word to yourself means less than your word to others.
That knowledge, held below conscious awareness but shaping everything, is one of the most significant limitations on human growth. Because the person who does not trust themselves does not attempt things that require self-trust to sustain, who does not start things that would require follow-through to complete, who does not commit to long-term processes because the internal record suggests that the long-term commitment will not hold. The private building practice rebuilds this trust, one kept promise at a time, not the grand promises, the small ones. The promise to yourself that the work will be done today. The promise to yourself that the minimum viable version of the habit will happen regardless of the quality of the day. The promise to yourself that this time is different, not because the intention is stronger, but because the follow-through will be consistent. Each kept promise is a deposit into the account of self-trust, and the deposits accumulate over weeks of showing up, over months of not breaking the chain, over the sustained private practice of doing what you said you would do when nobody is watching and nobody would know if you did not. The self-trust that builds from this practice is not the kind that can be given to you. Not the kind that comes from other people believing in you, or from a strong start, or from an initial period of visible success. It is earned from the inside through the private experience of being reliable to yourself, and it is the most durable kind there is. Build the self-trust in the private hours through the kept promises, one unwatched day at a time. Now, I want to talk about something that is genuinely difficult, something that most people feel but do not discuss honestly because admitting it feels like weakness. The private building is lonely. Not all the time, not in a way that cannot be navigated or that should discourage you from the practice, but genuinely, at various points in the private building season, there is a loneliness to it that needs to be acknowledged rather than dismissed. Human beings are social animals. We evolved in groups where the witnessing of effort by others had genuine adaptive value. The acknowledgement of contribution, the recognition of work, the social validation that effort is seen and valued. These needs are real. They are not signs of ego or insecurity or a failure to be sufficiently self-actualized. They are part of the fundamental architecture of being human. And the private building practice, by definition, withholds the external satisfaction of those needs. The work is happening, but no one is acknowledging it. The progress is real, but no one is celebrating it. The commitment is being maintained, but no one is recognizing the maintenance. And in the absence of that external acknowledgement, the internal experience of the building can feel, especially in the difficult stretches, especially on the days when the motivation is low and the results are not yet visible, profoundly unrewarded. This loneliness is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something important is happening, that the external scaffolding has been removed and the internal structure is being tested and built in its absence, that the muscle of internal motivation is being trained in the only way it can be trained, by doing the work without the external reward. But it needs to be navigated, and the navigation requires two things: The first is the acknowledgement of your own progress, the private record that substitutes for the external validation you are not seeking, the journal that tracks the work, the internal accounting that witnesses what the external world does not see. Because the need to have the work witnessed does not disappear when you choose private building. It needs to be met by the most reliable witness available to you, yourself. Be the witness your private work deserves. Track it honestly. Acknowledge it genuinely. Let the internal record be as accurate and as detailed as the public documentation would have been. And let the knowledge that you have this record, that you know what the work has been and what it is building, be enough to sustain the practice through the periods when external validation is absent. The second thing the loneliness requires is the maintenance of real human connection. Not the performance of connection, not the social media version of being in relationship with people. Real, genuine, reciprocal connection with the people in your life who know the real version of you rather than the presented one. The private building practice is not a practice of isolation. It is a practice of selective silence about the work. The relationships that sustain you, the genuine human connections that feed the parts of you that the private work cannot feed, those remain. Those are protected. Those are given real presence and real investment. The silence is about the work. The connection is about the person. And the person doing the work needs the connection to sustain the work over the long periods that the private building requires. Acknowledge your own progress, maintain real connection, navigate the loneliness, and continue building. Now, I want to address something that I think is the most practically important question in this entire conversation, more important than the why of private building, more important than the what. The most important question is the how. How do you actually build yourself consistently in the private hours, not as a spiritual discipline or a philosophical practice, as a daily, implementable, sustainable set of behaviors in the real conditions of your real life? The answer starts with the morning, before the world, before the notifications, before the demands of other people's days have arrived to compete with your own priorities. In the quiet before the noise begins, that is where the private building starts. Not because morning is the only time, but because morning is the time before the audience, before anyone is looking, before the performance layer of the day has been activated. In the morning, you are alone with yourself in the most complete way available in a connected modern life. And what you do in that aloneness, what you choose to give the first and best energy of the day to, is the most concentrated expression of your private building practice. Give that time to something real, something that builds the version of yourself that you are working toward. Not to the news, not to the feed, not to the reactive management of other people's communications, to the work, the learning, the practice, the honest internal examination of where you are and where you are going. 30 minutes, 1 hour, however much the private building requires and however much the morning allows. In that time, you are fully in your own development without witness and without performance. That time, sustained across a year of mornings, is the most significant investment you can make in yourself. Beyond the morning, the private building happens in the margins. The commute that becomes study time, the lunch hour that becomes practice time, the evening hour before sleep that becomes reflection time. These are not dramatic. They are not the heroic early morning hours that get posted about and celebrated. They are the invisible, ordinary, accumulating minutes that most people give away without realizing what they are worth.
Those minutes are worth more than most people's visible effort because they are given freely, without performance pressure, without the distortion of the observed moment. They are giving to the building purely, and pure building, however small in any individual instance, compounds into something extraordinary over the months and years of a private building practice. Claim the margins. Make them deliberate rather than accidental. Use them for the building rather than for the distraction that currently fills them. And let the accumulation of small, private, intentional investments in your own development do what accumulation always does: compound into something undeniable. I want to talk about the moment of return, because the private building is not forever. It is a season, and seasons end. And when the private building has produced enough, when the capability is genuine, and the character is solid, and the self-trust is built, and the development has reached the level that the season was building toward, you return to visibility, to engagement, to the full participation in the world that the private season was preparing you for. And this return is different from anything that the public building produces, because you are arriving with something real, not the performed version, not the managed version, not the version that has been constructed for an audience while the actual development lagged behind. You are arriving as the actual version, the person who was built in private, whose capability is genuine because it was developed without the distortion of the performance layer, whose character is solid because it was built through private choices rather than public performances, whose self-trust is real because it was earned through the consistent experience of being reliable to yourself in the moments when nobody would have known if you were not. That version of you changes every interaction, every opportunity, every relationship, every challenge you encounter in the world after the private building season. Because you are operating from a foundation that was built without compromise, that was built for the actual thing rather than the appearance of the thing, that was built in the private hours when the only reason to build was the building itself. And the world receives that version differently, not because the world is suddenly fair, or because effort is always rewarded, or because private building guarantees a particular outcome, but because genuine capability, genuine character, and genuine self-trust produce a quality of presence and performance that is distinguishable from the performed version. People can feel the difference between someone who actually knows what they are doing and someone who has become skilled at appearing to know what they are doing, between someone who is genuinely confident and someone who is performing confidence, between someone who actually cares about the work and someone who cares about how the work makes them look. The difference is not always conscious, but it is felt in every interaction, in every piece of work produced, in every decision made under pressure, in every moment when the practiced version and the genuine version would diverge. You come back as the genuine version, and the genuine version is something the world does not often encounter. It is rare, and rare things have a value that the common things do not. So let me bring this conversation to where it needs to end, with the specific, practical, tomorrow morning available decision that is being invited by everything I have said in this past hour. The decision is not dramatic. It is not a vow or a commitment or a declaration that requires the witness of anyone else to be valid. It is a private decision, made privately, for the private reasons that are yours and nobody else's. The decision is this: starting tomorrow morning, in the first available private moment, before the world has arrived to observe and evaluate and respond, you will build something real, something specific, something that the person you are trying to become requires, and that only the private hours can provide the conditions for. Not for the documentation of it, not for the recognition of it, for the building of it, for the person it makes you, for the life it produces over the months and years of private, consistent, unobserved practice. Nobody is watching. That is not a limitation. That is the permission, the freedom, the specific condition that makes genuine building possible. Nobody is watching. And so you can be fully there, in the work, in the building, in the private, daily, nobody else needs to know practice of becoming the person you actually want to be. Not the person you perform for the world, the person you build in private,
the person who exists in the unwatched hours, the person who becomes undeniable because the building was real. Nobody is watching. Go build.